Writing around Ulay's misinterpretation. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm really sorry I can't join you in person, but I'm in the process of moving. I very much appreciate the care Sophia has taken with the curation of Ulay's work and the experimental writing that's been produced in response to it, as well as the wonderful reading list which she has circulated. Given that I can't experience the presentation of Ulay's work directly in the gallery, I've decided to situate my words in response to the images of the work and the texts around Ulay's practice that have been made available to me online. I've taken Ulay's 11 aphorisms as a starting point for arranging 11 reflections drawn from my own writings on the relation between art and criticism. I've selected and reworked these to respond to some of the important questions Ulay raises in his work concerning ethics, interpretation, life, performance, and work. In his interview with Dominic Johnson, Ulay says a number of things that really caught my attention, and so my talk is a writing around two comments that he made there. Firstly, on art history, that as artists we can't get around one thing. Interpretation is always the last word. And second, his description of how performances circulate as part of oral culture. He says, it's a first-hand interpretation which enables a second-hand interpretation and so on, including misinterpretation, re-misinterpretation, re-misinterpretation. So, Aphorismos. I would like to start by reminding us that an aphorism is that which comes from the Greek aphorismos, or delimitation, distinction, definition. It's a concise saying or observation that expresses a general truth or principle, but most importantly, aphorisms come into being as the result of experience. 2. Art and writing. In the introduction to their 1999 edited collection, Rewriting Conceptual Art, Michael Newman and John Bird state that an essential part of the project of conceptual art was to demolish the distinctions between art practice, theory, and criticism. Even if the lasting legacy of conceptual art has not been to fully demolish disciplinary boundaries, to practice after conceptualism is to rethink the role writing can play in relating art and criticism. And there are many, from artists who write and produce text-based works, to writers who consider their books art, and critics who work with the poetics of criticism, as well as performance writers, poet-artist practitioners, and philosophers who question subjectivity through alternative visual writing forms. And clearly Ulay's aphorisms are positioned in that space, the one that conceptualism has opened up between art and writing. ArtWriting. In David Carrier's 1987 publication, ArtWriting, he explores how art criticism operates through the medium of writing. And in his subsequent book, Writing About Visual Art, he argues, in the literature of art, it's impossible to absolutely separate or entirely distinguish the arguments of an art writer from the literary structures used to present the arguments. Carrier asks how a written artefact describes art, and whether it's possible to create a written artefact that is able to both perform an equivalence with art as well as articulate an interpretive position. Yet while providing a clear account of how writing operates in particular pieces of art criticism, the implications of his interesting observations, that art writing is an object, and following J.L. Austin, that art writing performs actions, are not investigating through his own writing style. And this is where Ulay's reference to artivist comes to mind, and an image of the artist who acts by writing on his own body and by writing of the cutting of that writing out of his body to make another art. 4. Art writing. More recently, with the insertion of a hyphen, art writing came into being, which according to Mika Bal is a mode of criticism which aims to put the art first. Starting out as a literary critic, Bal considers visual art through processes of focalization. Following her desire for critical writing to bring one closer to art, Bell places the artwork at the centre of her texts, arguing that writing about art is not a substitute for the art. Rather than standing for the visual objects, texts about them ought, in the first place, to lead the reader back to those objects. But is a leading back to the art object a leading away from the written object, and so an underplaying of the ethical role of writing in making relations? And Ulay's work reminded me that the direction in which we are led matters differently for the critic than the artist who writes. 5. Sight writing. Since criticism, as acts of thinking and writing, are experienced in response to art and architectural works, they happen somewhere, they occur in situ. I would argue that the writing of criticism is a situated practice. The desire to work with variations in voice, form and structure, to reflect and create spatial distances and proximities between work and critic, reader and text, was the motivation for my sight writing work. Combining different genres and modes of writing in art criticism, whose critical voices are objective and subjective, distant and intimate, this approach develops alternative understandings of subjectivity and positionality, from the up close to the glance, from the caress to the accidental brush. Sight writing draws on spaces as they are remembered, dreamed and imagined, as well as observed, in order to take into account the critic's position in relation to a work and challenge criticism as a form of judgmental knowledge with a singular and static point of view, but a view that apparently comes from nowhere. 6. Prepositions. If criticism can be defined by the purpose of providing a commentary on a cultural work, then criticism always has an other in mind. The central task of criticism might then be considered as an ethical act. How does one relate to another? And here I have in mind the extraordinary series of performances by Ulay and Marina Abramovich, relation works, and their focus on the contested spaces of intersubjectivity. Through sight writing, I investigate the spatiality of a critic's relation to a work, adapting Howard Cagel's notion of strategic critique, where a position of judgment is advanced through the process of criticising, and in tune with Gavin Butt's call in After Criticism for the recognition of an immanent rather than a transcendent mode of contemporary criticality, which he argues is apprehended within and instanced as the performative act of critical engagement itself. Sight writing also resonates with those critics interested in the performative qualities of criticism. Amelia Jones and Andrew Stevenson, for example, take issue with the tradition that the interpreter must be neutral or disinterested in the objects which he or she judges, and they posit instead that the processes of viewing and interpreting involve entanglement in intersubjective spaces of desire, projection and identification. Interpretation, they argue, like the production of works of art, is a mode of communication. Meaning is a process of engagement and never dwells in one place. These commentaries on the operations of criticism make use of spatial terms to explore conceptual issues governing the relation between critic and artwork. Artist-filmmaker Trinity Minha has drawn attention to the significance assigned to the shift in use of prepositions, particularly from speaking about to speaking to. And following Minha, Eric Rogoff underscores how, by reclaiming and retelling narratives, speaking to, we alter the very structures by which we organise and inhabit culture. Adopting the preposition with rather than to, Rogoff discusses how the practice of writing with is a de-hierarchisation of the social relations governing the making of meaning in visual culture. And philosopher Michel Serres comments on the transformational aspect of prepositions. That's prepositions for you. They don't change in themselves, but they change everything around them: words, things, and people. Prepositions transform words and syntax, while préposés transform man. In my own work, I decided to move from writing about an object to writing to and with the object, and then to writing the object. And for today, this has involved engaging with Ulay's practice and what he says about his practice, and for those words to operate as a guide for a refiguring of my own writing around thematics that his work has put into play. So writing as a kind of coming after. 7. Sight reading. Literary critic Isabel Armstrong has closely examined the differences between close and distant reading. She distinguishes between a criticism of affect and one of analysis, but rejects the tendency to use a binary model to divide feeling and thought. Using highly spatialized language, Armstrong argues that it's the feeling-thought binary which itself installs a form of critique where the subject is located in a position of power over the text as other, producing a form of distant rather than close reading. She states that this form of reading rests upon an account of the text as outside, something external which has to be grasped or warded off. And the scene of reading itself has been described by literary critic Mary Jacobus in terms of a relation which exists between the inner world of the reader and the world contained in a book. I suggest that the writing of criticism involves such a double movement back and forth between inside and outside. Works take critics outside themselves, offering new geographies, new possibilities, but they also return critics to their own interiors, to their own autobiographies. Although the critic is expected to remain objective or exterior to the work, at the same time he or she is invited to enter the work's world. As well as its physical position outside the critic, the work also occupies the site of the critic's psychic life, igniting interior emotions and memories. This pair of two-way movements between critic and work suspends what we might call judgment or discrimination in criticism, and instead, through the practice of what I call sight writing, traces but also constructs a web of interlocking sites between subjects and objects, works and texts, artists and critics, writers and readers. 8. Life writing. A key aspect of situated knowledge, a term coined by philosopher Donna Haraway, is the locatedness of personal experience and the relation of one person's life experience to another's, which brings us very much into the field of life writing, biography, autobiography, and most recently, the auto theory of a writer like Maggie Nelson. The oral historian Linda Sandino has drawn on the work of Paul Ricoeur to consider how different forms of figuration operate in narration, relating the act of telling to the told, such that oral history might be itself understood as a double interpretive operation in which the narrator recapitulates the told in the telling. Following Ricoeur, Sandino describes the individual in interpreting his or her life appears both as reader and writer, and the story of a life continues to be refigured by all the truthful and fictive stories a subject tells about himself or herself. A life is not how it was, but how it is interpreted and reinterpreted, told and retold. In the feminist figurations offered by Donna Haraway and Rosie Bradotti, spatial arrangements are an intrinsic aspect of their storytelling function, specifically the role of actual locations and the cartographies of power relations and the differing positionalities they generate. Bradotti writes, "Figurations are not mere metaphors, but rather markers of more concretely situated historical positions. A figuration is the expression of one's specific positioning in space and time. It marks certain territorial or geopolitical coordinates, but it also points out one's sense of genealogy, of historical inscription. Figurations re-territorialise and destabilise the certainties of the subject and allow for a proliferation of situated or micro-narratives of self and others." And I would like to think here of how Ulay's work has refigured my writing, but also how his practice might be considered life writing, or perhaps more aptly, life work. 9. Life work. In giving an account of oneself, Judith Butler argues that the I has no story of its own that is not also the story of a relation or a set of relations to a set of norms. She goes on to note that if the I is not at one with moral norms, this means that the subject must deliberate upon these norms, and that part of such a deliberation will entail a critical understanding of the social genesis and meaning of those norms. Butler writes, "In this sense, ethical deliberation is bound up with the operation of critique, and critique finds that it cannot go forward without a consideration of how the deliberating subject comes into being and how a deliberating subject might actually live or appropriate a set of norms. Not only does ethics find itself embroiled in the task of social theory, but social theory, if it is to yield non-violent results, must find a place for this I." And this quote sums up for me so succinctly the searching out aspects of Ulay's identity research. 10. Open work. In his classic essay from 1962, The Poetics of the Open Work, Umberto Eco argues that the poetics of the work in movement installs a new relationship between the contemplation and the utilisation of a work of art. Coming out of his reflections on music, Eco adopts the terms performer and interpreter in this text, and in a footnote he writes, "For the purposes of aesthetic analysis, however, both cases can be seen as different manifestations of the same interpretive attitude." I would argue that there are distinctions in both attitude as well as manifestation between interpreter and performer, and that these vary according to discipline and are negotiated according to specific conditions of responsibility and engagement. And I want to return here to Ulay's comment that, as an artist, we can't get around one thing. Interpretation is always the last word. And suggest that criticism might offer, rather than the last word, the next word, to create a dialogic practice between art and criticism, one that is relational. And this seems to be something that comes to life in the wonderful conversation between Dominic and Ulay. Following up on Eco's work, the art critic Claire Bishop argues that the history of installation art needs to be based on the viewer's experience, and suggests that it's in the degree of proximity between model subject and literal viewer which may provide a criterion of aesthetic judgment for installation art. Bishop doesn't discuss the critic as a precise category of viewing subject. However, I suggest that with his or her responsibility to interpret and perform the work for another audience, the critic occupies a discrete position as mediator between the artwork and Bishop's viewing and model subjects. I consider the critic to be a particular kind of art user whose acts of use are relational and involve both interpretation and performance. And here Ulay's beautiful comment on how oral ritual circulates ephemeral performance, to find your work in someone's mouth, is particularly resonant, and suggests how this speaking of a performance is a re-performing and a misperforming, and a new way for me of thinking about acts, speech and otherwise, of interpretation. And this reminded me too of something Marie Rose Logan notes when writing of Gérard Genet's Figures of Literary Discourse, that the meanings of figura actually parallel those of the Greek term schema. In Aristotle's writings, schema is used either to render a rhetorical notion or simply to designate a shape, such as the shape of a mouth. 11. Use object. In his 1968 paper, The Use of an Object, D.W. Winnicott describes how relating may be to a subjective object, but usage implies that the object is part of external reality. For Winnicott, to use an object is to take into account its objective reality or existence as a thing in itself, rather than its subjective reality or existence as a projection. The change from relating to using is for him significant. It means that the subject destroys the object, that the object stands outside the omnipotent control of the subject, recognised as the external object it has always been. In exploring how artists and critics use psychoanalytic theory, Juliet Mitchell discusses her own desire to use theory rather than relate to it. To use a theory, she says, we have to destroy it, and when it survives, it will be in a different place. One where it is independent from the artist critic and is therefore charged with the capacity of a use object. If one does not use the theory, she argues, all one can do is apply it or question it within its own terms. Reflecting on this, I wonder whether my impulse to write the object or artwork, to reproduce it textually, is a form of use. In reworking Elena Brotherus's triptych Spring in my own 3-part text installation Les Mots and les Choses, and Nathan Coley's Black Tent in my scripted Screen and embellishment Perda, have I, in Winnicott's sense, used these artworks? Has my reworking involved a form of destruction which has allowed the artworks to exist in a different place, independent of me? If so, has sight writing gone some way to engage with how critics might use artworks and perhaps indicate how using art might be rather different from viewing art, suggesting that using rather than viewing art repositions how a critic might write a work. Ulay's comments about how discontent as an ethical position informs his practice rather than a desire to create have made me wonder again about destruction's role in repositioning, but also in re-empowering a subject in relation. I need to make it clear that when talking of destruction, I am talking about how the psychic destruction of certain internal objects makes new possibilities for external objects or subjects. And concerning Ulay, the subject of this talk, I would like to make possible a relation of art to criticism where there is no last word. Thank you.